Hey everyone, it's Classic DM, and this is another episode from our Rise of Aya series where I want to go over, in a series of relatively short videos, some of my house rules. So everyone who plays D&D likes to do things a little differently, and the game has changed so much over the years. So let's just take a kind of a basic situation and talk about it real quick, and then after that we'll break it down into how do my personal house rules, which in some ways are kind of a reflection of how the game's changed over the years anyway, how do they actually work? And love to hear what you think. So let's say we have a situation like this. This is our map from the village of Hamlet. We got our 6 heroes hanging out here. Say they're sitting at the table. This could be a gameplay situation that happens to you. And, some baddies come in the front door, right? And you say, roll for initiative, and you start having a combat sequence. So one of the first things you're going to have to understand about advanced Dungeons and Dragons before you do any of this is the modern version of the game is so much more streamlined. Streamlined in the sense that the time is compressed. The time in original advanced D&D is really long. It's almost like a war game. If you ever played an old school Avalon Hill war game, or the turns are really, really long. You have all these movement turns and combat turns and all this kind of stuff. So in this situation, what you really have is, a game where miniature wargaming was hot to trot in the 70s, and D&D kind of evolved from a community of people who were designing games like that. You have games like Traveler and all this kind of stuff, and they use a really long stretched out time frame. So we're going to take these kids off the board real quick, right? Let's just move this over here, and we're going to pull out our marker board, and we'll come back to them later. Let's pull out our marker board. We've got some notes here we want to go over with you, right? So one of the first things I think we should talk about like right away is just these two concepts right here, time and movement. So in D&D, advanced D&D, by default, which is different than it is today, there's three basic elements of time. And time also is used to measure movement. If you say you're driving down the road, you're 25 miles an hour or 70 miles an hour. That's miles per hour. So movement is always in relation to time, right? Not to be a physics class. So in D&D, they had the turn, the round, and the segment. And in the original version of the game, the turn is, it's 10 minutes. So they're having rules in the game, and everything is based on a 10-foot square. Unlike our squares here on our battle map, which are 5 feet. So, let's just put one character down here. This is a 5-foot square. Here's a 5-foot square. Each one of these grids, 1-inch grid is equals 5 feet. In the original D&D, all the maps and stuff, like the ones done for the Village of Hamlet, all that kind of stuff, each one of these squares is 10 feet. So they were just having paper maps. The miniature thing didn't really even happen until like 1980 when Grenadier and Raoul Parfa and all these other companies started making miniatures at like 25 millimeter, and then they got bigger and bigger and bigger. So in the beginning, they were designing a game to work around a 10-foot square on graph paper. All right. So you were kind of imagining where your characters were. So it wasn't about this close range combat that kind of evolved in 3rd edition really, really well, a lot in 4th edition. And then you have Warhammer and all these other games where miniature collecting and painting miniatures. It becomes much more like a miniature war game and tactical. So in the beginning, the turn was 10 minutes. And what would you use a turn for? A turn would be used to things like your party's, checking out all the perimeter walls for secret doors. And you can only check one 10 by 10 square per turn. I mean, that's a long, long time. 10 minutes. I mean, it's longer than most Rush songs, but it's a long time. Now, when you got into combat in AD&D, it was always a round. They would call it a melee round. And a round was always 60 seconds. So it's a full minute. And then if you take that and divide it by 10, it's 6 seconds. Now, you may remember, if you play other versions in D&D, a melee round over the years has kind of replaced the word segment and become this word here. For example, right now in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, they have a melee round. It's 6 seconds. It's not a minute, right? They don't use the word turn anymore. They don't use segment anymore. So if you're playing Pathfinder and you're playing a dwarf fighter and you got some, dark elf come up to fight you, well, in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, you have stride, strike, and whatever else the other one was, I forgot, and move. So you can move 25 feet up to 3 times in a 3-action economy with no attack of opportunity or anything. So, for example, let's say your dwarf guy is way back here with the door open by this fireplace, right? And he's looking at the fireplace. And this guy bursts in the front door, and he says he wants to go run all the way in here and attack you. And maybe he wins initiative. So he can go, the movement is different. You can count the diagonal squares differently. But let's just say we didn't count the diagonals differently. So we just did everything rectilinear. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's the first 25 feet. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Second 25 feet. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's 75 some odd feet of individual like checkered movement. That's really, really far. That's more than half the length of the entire inn, okay? So in the modern versions of the games, the amount of, especially Pathfinder is very guilty of this. I like Pathfinder, it's very cool, but I think this is one element of that kind of makes it kind of bad, is that the amount of distance you can move is so far, even if you're in combat. So for example, if these two guys were fighting right here in Pathfinder, and this person decided to turn and run away, and it's their turn, they could have moved that entire distance. Now, you certainly could have pursued them in your chance to move this entire distance, and there's not a lot of attack of opportunity happening where, you know, as your good guy chases and runs between these two, they don't get free swings at you anymore. So it got very movement oriented. Let's go back though to AD&D and what its movement is by default. And we're going to talk about how it is in the default rules first. Okay, and then we're going to talk about my house rules, which make things a little bit faster, a little bit more tactical. So in the default version of the game, let's use our dwarf fighter guy in the middle, just standing in the middle between these 4 columns here in the inn, and we'll just use this little elf drow elemental evil bad guy. In the default game, in a 1-minute melee round, you can move what they call 12 inches. So let's pull up a quick little chart here on the right-hand side. This is from the Player's Handbook on page, 102? And if you look over here on the right-hand side, I'll move my cursor over here a little bit. They have movement rates always described in inches. You see this chart right here? The distance traveled in one round, which is 1 minute, or segment, which is 6 seconds. So they say in 1 minute of combat, you know, because remember, they're trying to treat it like a war game, okay? 1 minute you can move 60 feet. So if he's here and this guy is here, how far? Let's say they're in a straight line. Let's get rid of the, let's say the table gets pushed out of the way. So 60 feet would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's 7 times 5. So 60 feet would be 12 of these, right? And because each one of those inches means 10 feet. So they mean 60 feet, not 6 inches. That's the thing that's tricky about it. If you read the original AD&D rules, they're not saying you can move 6 inches, which would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You actually move twice as far as that, which would be 12. So in one melee round, he's standing here by the fireplace, and you're here. In Pathfinder, with 3 sets of moves of 25 feet, with 75 feet, with 6 inches, he's going to be able to move 60 feet in his turn, which is almost as far, but not quite as far. Now, the problem with that is that what if the two of you were engaged in a melee fight? These two are duking it out, swords, parries, blocks. So in a full minute of combat, right, a full minute of combat, say the druid's over here, and a caster's going to try to cast a spell in the back, and let's say these girls are trying to shoot crossbows from standing on top of the table at you, right? In a full melee round, let's get another one of these girls up here. Here we go, let's put her on the ground. In a full melee round, these two are duking it out. And the way it happens, the way they describe it is that you get, you know, one chance to hit, you're rolling a d20 to see you hit this guy by his armor class, you miss. That's your turn. That basically implies that the two of you were juking and jiving and moving and blocking and parrying and doing all this stuff. And finally, after all that fighting and testing each other's defenses, it's almost like they'd only be, you know, in a UFC fight, there's 5 5-minute rounds, and each round is 5 minutes. So, you know, there's only 5 melee rounds in one UFC fight. All that's implied to be going on between the two characters for a full minute. Now, if someone tries to disengage, there's rules about your armor class dropping and things like that. But if you were to say to yourself, okay, he's just going to stand here, you're standing here, and he's just going to run for it, right? In a full minute, he can move 60 feet, which is 12 squares, right? But when you're in combat, in a 6-second segment, okay, you can only move a tenth of that, which means 12 feet. So if you compress the melee round down to a segment, which is more reasonable because more things can happen on a moment-to-moment basis, you run the risk of what we have in the chart here, where you could only end up moving 12 feet. Let's look at the chart here on the right-hand side so you can see what I'm talking about. The normal movement rate for humans and our humanoids in advanced D&D is it's always called 12 inches, which really means 120 feet. So you got to divide that by 10 to get your movement rate for one segment. So in essence, in what would be a round in Pathfinder 2nd edition or a round in 5th edition D&D, you could only move 12 feet, which doesn't really line up. 12 feet is less than distance from the free throw to the edge of the rim on a basketball court. That's 15 feet. Okay, so if you think about that, could you really move that far in 6 seconds? Well, the UFC Octagon's 25 feet. So It's kind of a weird thing. So the rule that I like to use is I get rid of the long 1 minute round and I change everything to be a melee round is the 6 second segment, but I increase the movement rate to kind of consider you're engaged in melee combat, and I round it up to the next square, so 15. And it really kind of, and I also provide another number, which is when you're not engaged. So I kind of split it into two concepts. You're engaged in melee combat, which limits you to this base movement rate number, and then you're just charging or running across the battlefield at top speed. No one's hitting you, and that's a different move. It's always twice that. Now let's take a look and see what would that really be, right? What would that? How would that work out? So let's get our dwarf fighter guy again. Where is he? Let's say he's here. Here's you're and the bad guy are fighting here. Some other girl comes on the scene, and I don't know. Let's put your cleric back over here. She's back here in the back. So let's say the cleric wins initiative, and the cleric decides that she wants to run forward and engage this target in melee combat. And let's just pull her character sheet up, because you'll be able to see on the character sheet. This is her right here, okay? Emma Lamore, you just call her Emma. So Emma decides, she says, when it's her turn, I want to engage in melee distance and attack this dual-wielding girl, right? Whatever, she's got 2 rapiers in her hand. And in fact, let's get our little cool close-up camera here. You can see a better view of what they look like. So she decides to do that, right? Well, let's just hide her character sheet real quick. You don't need to see that. All right, so where is she? She's over here. All right, she says, I'm going to go. Her goal is to attack this target here. So with the movement rate I'm using on the character sheet, which is reduced down to a 6-second segment, how far can she move? Well, she's currently unengaged. And doesn't mean she's not engaged to be married. She's not engaged in combat. If someone was in her face and beating on her, she's engaged in combat. For her to disengage from combat, she's going to give up some of her defenses and make a break for it, which is kind of like attack of opportunity. But if you turn to flee or turn your back, you don't get the shield bonus anymore. You don't get the dexterity bonus. As a DM, I'll also drop your armor class by 2 anyway, even though she may have chainmail armor on. So the moment she starts moving, if she disengages from that combat, she's going to get a penalty from anyone nearby her because she's engaged. But in this example, she's not engaged. She's just running past this guy here to come over here. So how far could she really move? Can she get there in 1 turn? Let's pull up her player panel again. So her movement rate, notice how I have 15/30. And we're talking about this region here. We have armor class 3, hit points 8, 15/30. Do you remember how before I was talking about how if you did it the old school way, you can only move 12 feet? Well, this is a 5x5 square. This is a 5x5 square, and maybe almost halfway the next square. So in old school D&D, she could only move that far in a segment, right? And if she's engaged in combat, they don't really differentiate between being engaged in combat and not really being engaged. They do a little bit, but it's not a lot of, the movement rates don't change. They don't say, oh, you can move twice as fast when you're unengaged versus you're engaged, and that's kind of the house rule I'm doing. So what I'm changing is I'm going to go ahead and round you up to the next square. So I'm going to go ahead and round you up to the next square. In fact, we'll move these 2 out of the way and just use the girl as the example here. You're standing here. I'm going to go ahead and round that 12 up to 15, okay? Which is 3 1-inch squares. If you weren't engaged, I'm going to double it and give you another 3 squares because no one's hitting you. So in her segment, it's her turn. These 2 are fighting over here. They're tied up doing stuff. Whatever else is going on in the bar. In fact, we'll put these guys over here. They're fighting on top of the table, right? So they're fighting on top of the table, and her goal is to make it to this character here. So she can move 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which is 30 feet. That's where the 15/30 comes from. So I'm going to use feet. So in my character sheets, I talk about it in terms of feet. And why do I talk about it in terms of feet? Because that's what the original rules talk about. They talk about it in terms of feet. Now, this is where it gets really confusing. They talk about it in inches, but when they're talking about a segment, they're talking about in feet. And that's pretty reasonable, okay? The UFC Octagon is 25 feet. So you have 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. So one fighter is at one end of the UFC Octagon, another fighter is at the other end of the Octagon. And you all seen these UFC fights. I'm a big UFC fan, as you can tell. And they're moving around and jockeying around, and flying knees are happening. All this happen. They're pretty much engaged in combat. So it's not unreasonable for someone to come moving, charging across here, and kneeing Ben Askren in the head, right? So that's not unreasonable amount of movement in 6 seconds. So that's the reason why we have this I changed that rule, so I call it kind of a house rule. Now let's define, that's unengaged movement. Let's clear this out a little bit, and let's talk about engaged movement. So this is where it becomes, whoops, this is where it becomes the 15 number. And I may go back to the overhead view so you can see it a little bit better, because I think this is a little too close. Let's pull that down. Let's go back to her. So she's here. Say she's with her dwarf buddy. Here's a target she wants to go attack. She wants to attack this target. In fact, let's say there's a caster casting this spell, and both the dwarf and the cleric want to go over there and whack her in the face and try to interrupt the spell. But let's say the dwarf is fighting this person, and she's fighting this person, and they're fighting back to back like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, right? So these two are fighting back to back, right? She's facing this way, he's facing this way, and this meanie comes in the scene and starts winding up a fireball, and you're like, oh my goodness, or whatever, right? So they're engaged. So the distance that they can move would be less. And what I do is I cut it in half. So let's pull up that player panel again. So remember, you said it can move 30 feet when you're unengaged, and you can move only 15 if you're engaged. So if she's going to try to move away, 1, 2, 3, she's just in range to now attack this target. But when that happens, okay, she's almost like doing the attack of opportunity thing that happened in 3.5. What I do is I don't really use an attack of opportunity. What I do is if someone runs past someone and they were already fighting you, right, they can take a swipe at you and your armor class gets reduced. So her armor class is 3, right? Let's take away the shield. That puts her at 4. And then we could take away another 2 because she has her back turned and put her down to 6. And if we wanted to, we could drop our armor class by another penalty too, because the guy's trying to stab you right in the back right when you run by. And he may get a free chance to hit her. He could actually kill her. He might even kill her from behind as she runs by. She's completely exposing her back. Now, if she were to maintain defense and defensively back away, she could still move the same distance, but I want my players to say that. That's the difference between my table and a lot of people's tables, is I use facing direction. A lot of people don't use it. They can't handle it. I don't know why. I love it. So if these two are engaged in combat, this person pulls up, starts winding up a spell, and it's her turn. He's already swung and missed. She can say, I want to defensively close the gap between me and the caster so I can turn around at the last second, take a swapper. So I want to turn my back, turn towards my target, keep my shield up, maintain my defenses, and that he won't get an attack. That's because she's actively defending. That's how I handle it. You're either defending, actively defending, or you're not actively defending. If you're actively defending, she gets the full benefits of her armor class, but she gets to move at the engaged movement rate. So in this case, you can see where she moved. She started here, right? One of her rocks fell off. Here's 5. Here's the other 5. Here's the other 15. And in my game, if you're within a 5-foot square of a target, you're considered close enough to strike them with any melee weapon. If it's a halberd, might be a little bit longer, but I just leave it even at 5. So all she needs to do is to get right here. If she can get right here, actively defending herself, she now gets close range where she can actually, on her next turn, she could turn around and swipe this girl, right? On her next turn, she might dump the spell anyway and change her target to be him or her right in front of her or what have you. Let me show you that again with the overhead camera, okay? So we're going to pull this out of the way. And just going to move this camera back out of here. So we're going to start all the way back over that description. We'll do it one more time. And let's use it with the overhead camera. So we had our cleric engaged with a melee fight. These two are going at it like this. We have our buddy back to back, Butch Cassidy, Sundance Kid, fighting like this. Caster pulls up here, gets ready to start casting a spell. You're playing the fight. You're at my table. We're having a great time. You're doing whatever you want to do. Say the last person's attack was this baddie. He took a swipe at her. Maybe she blocks it with her shield. Ping, ching, misses it. That player says, I want to rush the caster. Now, if you just say I want to rush the caster, and you don't give any other additional description, I'm assuming that you're going to go 1, 2, 3, and you've turned your back. And as you get to the square here, he's going to take a stab at you in the back to get a free attack as you go by. But if you're smart, you say, I want to continue defending, but I want to change my position to get closer to the caster. So my turn comes back up again. I can turn and change targets to her. But while I'm moving, I'm actively defending. So you can do that he won't even get a chance to swing because there isn't an attack of opportunity in 1st edition. If it was 3rd edition or Pathfinder 1 or Pathfinder 2, or maybe even D&D, there might be an attack of opportunity just because you moved within proximity of him. So that's how I handle the time and the movement in my table. So let's go back to our summary board here real quick. Move these kids out the way. And let's get this out of the way. Let's go back to our summary board. So all you got to remember is that when you're in combat, when you're in melee combat or spell casting or shooting or moving or doing anything you want to do, we call it a round. It really is a segment. The movement rate technically should be 12 feet, but we can't really measure that in the grid. We round it up to the next number, okay? Then there's two types of things happen. You're actively defending, or you're engaged in combat, or you're doing something else, which is fleeing, you're charging, you're closing a door, you're running, you're closing the distance. So no one's hitting you. You're not having to defend yourself. You can freely move across the octagon. You can freely move across the battlefield. This movement rate is twice the movement rate of this. Make sense? Cool. Leave a comment and let me know what you think. If you want any more description about this kind of stuff, let me know. And we're going to do more of these breakdowns of individual rules along the way. The next thing I want to talk about is how I handle spell casting. Okay, cool. We'll talk to you later and hope you had fun. See ya.